The Devil's Hollow. In the heart of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, there lies a small town named Salem. It's a picturesque town with beautiful scenery and friendly locals, but beneath the surface, there's a dark history that the townspeople don't like to talk about. For years, the town had been plagued by strange occurrences, from unexplained disappearances to mysterious deaths. People whispered that the town was cursed, and that the devil himself had a hand in the town's misfortunes. The townspeople tried to ignore the rumors, but they couldn't deny that something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, and an eerie feeling that hung over the town like a shroud. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the nearby woods. They were bored and looking for something to do, so they thought it would be fun to see if they could find any evidence of the town's dark past. As they walked deeper into the woods, they began to notice strange symbols etched into the trees. The symbols looked like they had been carved with a sharp blade, and they were unlike anything the teenagers had ever seen before. As they continued to walk, the woods grew darker and the air grew colder. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream, and they realized that one of their friends was missing. They searched frantically for their friend, calling out his name, but there was no response. They tried to retrace their steps, but they found themselves lost in the maze-like woods. As the night fell, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old abandoned cabin, its windows shattered, and its roof caved in. Despite their fear, they knew they had no choice but to seek shelter in the cabin. As they stepped inside, they were hit by a wave of cold air that seemed to seep into their bones. Suddenly, they heard a faint whispering sound, as if someone was speaking in tongues. They tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder and more intense, until it was a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. The walls of the cabin began to shake, and the floorboards creaked and groaned. The teenagers clung to each other in terror, unsure if they would survive the night. As the sun began to rise, the noise suddenly stopped. The cabin was still, and the air was calm. The teenagers cautiously stepped outside, grateful to be alive. But as they looked back at the cabin, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes, and it seemed to be beckoning them to come closer. The teenagers knew that they had to leave, and they ran as fast as they could back to the safety of the town. They never spoke of their experience again, but they knew that they had encountered something truly evil in the woods that night. To this day, the abandoned cabin still stands in the woods, and the townspeople avoid the area at all costs. They know that the Devil's Hollow is a place best left unexplored, and that the town's dark past is something that should never be forgotten. The Legend of the Wendigo. In the heart of Virginia's Great Smoky Mountains, there is a small town called Blackwood. It's a quiet town, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills, but there's a dark legend that haunts the area. According to the legend, a creature known as the Wendigo roams the woods, preying on unsuspecting hikers and campers. The Wendigo is said to be a towering figure with matted fur and sharp claws, and it has an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Most people dismiss the legend as a myth, but there are some who swear that they've encountered the creature in the woods. They describe its glowing eyes and its bone-chilling howls, and they warn others to stay away from the area. One summer, a group of friends decided to go on a camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. They were excited to explore the beautiful scenery and to experience the thrill of being in the wilderness. As they set up their tents and started a fire, they heard a strange sound coming from the woods. It was a low growling noise, like an animal in pain. They dismissed it as a harmless animal, but as the night wore on, the sound grew louder and more intense. They tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling of unease that settled over them like a blanket. As the sun began to set, they saw a figure moving in the woods. It was a tall, thin figure with glowing eyes, and it seemed to be watching them. They tried to stay calm, but their fear began to escalate when they heard the creature's howls. It sounded like a mix between a human scream and a wild animal's cry, and it echoed through the woods like a death knell. The friends realized that they were being hunted by the Wendigo, and they knew that they had to get out of the woods before it was too late. They packed up their things and started to run, but they soon realized that the Wendigo was pursuing them. They could hear its heavy breathing and its claws scratching against the trees, and they knew that they had to keep moving if they wanted to survive. As they ran, they stumbled upon an old cabin deep in the woods. It was dilapidated and abandoned, but it offered shelter from a creature that was pursuing them. They barricaded the door and huddled together in terror, hoping that the creature wouldn't be able to get in. But as the night wore on, they could hear the Wendigo scratching at the door, trying to find a way inside. The friends knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin forever, and they knew that they had to find a way to escape the creature's grasp. With trembling hands, they opened the door and ran as fast as they could through the woods. They could hear the creature's howls in the distance, but they didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their car. As they drove away from the woods, they looked back at the forest, knowing that they had narrowly escaped the wrath of the Wendigo. They knew that the legend was more than just a myth, and that the creature that haunted the woods was all too real. The forest was dense and foreboding as I made my way deeper into the heart of Virginia. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay, and the ground was slick with dew. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs set my heart racing. I was starting to regret my decision to venture into the woods alone, but I was determined to find the abandoned cabin I'd heard so much about. After what felt like hours of hiking, I finally stumbled upon the cabin. It was weather-beaten and dilapidated, with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls that were coated in moss. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was pitch black, but I could just make out the outline of the fireplace in the corner. As I fumbled for my flashlight, I heard a faint whispering sound. It was almost imperceptible, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, and I realized that it was coming from the walls themselves. The wood was alive with 1,000 voices, all murmuring in unison. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to make my way to the door, but it had slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. The whispering grew louder and more insistent. I could hear words now, whispers of long-forgotten secrets and ancient curses. The cabin began to shake, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Suddenly, the voices stopped. There was a deafening silence, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. And then, from the darkness, emerged a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes glowed like hot coals. She reached out a hand, beckoning me closer. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The woman came closer and closer until I could feel her icy breath on my neck. And then she spoke, her voice a chilling whisper in my ear. "Welcome to my home," she said. "You'll never leave." With that, the cabin shook again, and the walls began to close in around me. I screamed and clawed at the wood, but it was no use. I was trapped, and I knew I would never leave. And so I remain a prisoner of a haunted cabin in the heart of Virginia. My screams are lost in the whispering of the walls, and my fate is sealed. I can only hope that one day someone will find me and release me from this cursed place. But until then, I am doomed to haunt the cabin, trapped forever in a nightmare that never ends.